So, hello everyone. We have already started with the reproductive system, and I believe that you all have finished studying the male reproductive system. I continue with the female reproductive system. So, before we really move into the female reproductive system, I would like to give you all, a brief introduction into the topic. Now, to highlight the difference between, or the fundamental difference between the male and the female reproductive system is the female reproductive functions or the release of gametes happens in a cyclic pattern all through their reproductive life, whereas it's a continuous phenomenon in males from puberty till death. That's the main difference there. Now, if you look at the structural and the functional changes of the female reproductive system, during each cycle, which is very synchronized with the changes which are happening in the hypothalamo-pituitary ovarian axis. That's a very important point to be remembered there. Now, whatever the response, the ovary shows to the hypothalamo anterior pituitary hormones is basically responsible for the cyclic changes which are happening in the female reproductive organs, especially in the ovaries and the uterus. Now, to brief up, the ovarian changes which are happening are mainly related to growth, maturation, and the release of gametes, and also the secretion of hormones. Now, the uterine changes are mainly the endometrial changes which are happening, and the endometrial changes which are happening is in such a way the aim is to nourish the implanted gamete, or even the shedding of the endometrium, which is associated with uterine bleeding when there is no fertilization happening. Now, these cyclical changes in the human beings, we refer it as the menstrual cycle, and the uterine bleeding, we call it as menstruation. Now, if you look at this picture, which is our second slide, the figure actually shows parts of the uterus and the fallopian tube. Now, first let's look at the uterus there. Uterus, that it's basically a hollow organ having a very thick muscular wall, and it's placed between the urinary bladder anteriorly, and you have the rectum on the posterior part of the uterus. Uterus has got two parts, the corpus and the cervix. You can see it in the picture. Now, the body of the uterus, which is the corpus, consists of two layers, the myometrium and the endometrium. Now, the myometrium, it consists of multiple layers of smooth muscles. Now, for us, the functional importance, we need to know in detail about the endometrium. So, the endometrium in the uterus has got two layers, a stromal layer which is very close to the myometrium, and an epithelium. Now, in the stroma, you can see the spiral arteries which have penetrated, and it contains a lot of connective tissues. The epithelium contains the uterine glands which are lined by the secretory cells. The glands also infiltrate into the stroma. The arterial and the glandular changes which occur in different phases of the menstrual cycle we will be discussing in detail. Now, this endometrial tissue is cyclically shedded, which results in the menstrual bleeding phase, which we will discuss in the menstrual cycle. Now, you know that in pregnancy, this uterus is capable of enlarging, and it can accommodate a growing fetus. And also at the time of parturition, the uterine movements under the influence of many hormones is capable of expelling the fetus which grows in the uterus. Now, if you look at the cervix, you can see the picture of the cervix there. Cervix is basically a narrow muscular tube which connects the body of the uterus with the vagina. It has an internal os, cervical canal, and the external os. These are the three parts of the uterine cervix: the internal os, the cervical canal, and the external os. Now, the mucus of the cervix changes from thick to thick and viscous liquid to profuse, watery and highly elastic liquid, which actually forms the physiological basis of the spin bucket test for ovulation. We will be doing it in detail later. Now, under the influence of the hormone estrogen, cervical mucus forms a very typical fern pattern which disappears following ovulation, or after ovulation you won't find this fern pattern which is shown by the cervical mucus. Cervical dilation is an important event in the initiation of parturition. So understanding the physiological anatomy or the functional anatomy of the female reproductive system is very important. Now you can see on the two sides of the uterus, you can see the fallopian tubes. The two fallopian tubes arise from both sides of the upper poles of the uterus, and you can see the oviduct there, which is around 10 to 15 centimeters in length, and it has got three parts. The three parts are the isthmus, the ampulla and the infundibulum. Now it's basically this infundibulum which opens into the pelvic cavity, which are very close to the ovaries. Now the opening of the infundibulum, you can see there are some finger-like projections which you call as the fimbriae. So every time the ovum is released from the ovary, it's this finger-like openings which we call as the fimbriae, which catches the ovum and transports it through the oviduct, and you know that fertilization happens in the fallopian tube. Now let's know a little about the ovaries. We'll be discussing ovaries in detail in the coming up slides. Now ovaries, you can see that there are two ovaries, and each ovary weighs around 10 gram in an adult female. Each one present on both sides of the uterus, and they are attached to the uterus by a ligament which you call as the ovarian ligaments. An ovary, basically you look at the structure, it consists of two parts. You have the cortex and the medulla. Now if you look at the cortex of the ovary, the cortex is basically the outer zone or the major part of the ovary, which is lined by the germinal epithelium, and this is surrounded by a layer of cells which you call as tunica albuginea, and oocytes are present in the cortex of the ovary. That's a point you need to remember. And each oocyte is enclosed within a follicle. Each oocyte will be enclosed within an oocyte, and the ovarian follicles, and I hope I have mentioned that each oocyte will be inside a follicle, and which you refer to as the ovarian follicle. And the ovarian follicles in an ovary will be present in different stages of their development. A matured follicle we call by the name a Graafian follicle. So that's about the cortex of the ovary. Now if you look at the medulla of the ovary, now just the inner part of the cortex, or the inner part of the ovary, we call as the medulla of the ovary. And if you look at the functions of the ovary as a whole, oogenesis happens in the ovary, maturation of oocyte, secretion of female sex hormones and peptide hormones, and even ovulation are functions of the female ovaries. Now if you look at, even though I have stated 4 important functions of ovary, the primary most important function of ovary is the development of ovarian follicle and to release ovum at the time of ovulation, and also secretion of steroid hormones. And basically it's these steroid hormones secreted by the ovary which controls the various reproductive and metabolic functions in females. I think the functional anatomy of the female reproductive system is clear for you all. Now let me take you all to oogenesis. Now oogenesis is a very often asked 5 marker or even a 3 marker for you all. So now if you look at oogenesis, now different from spermatogenesis, what happens is spermatogenesis starts at puberty, and continues throughout the life. Just make it brief, till death. From puberty till death, spermatogenesis happens. But there's something very interesting which is happening with oogenesis. The whole process of oogenesis starts in the fetal life. Right from fetal life, when the baby is inside the mother's womb, oogenesis starts, and it stops at menopause. Now the process of development of spermatocyte is completed in few days, isn't it? Whereas now this development of oocyte, which starts right from the baby, the baby girl is inside the mother's womb, but it's completed only at the time of ovulation, which will occur once the girl has attained puberty or during the menstrual cycle. Now, the development of oocytes, it basically occurs in 3 stages. The oogonia, which becomes a primary oocyte, the primary oocyte which is getting converted to a secondary oocyte, and finally the secondary oocyte, which is released as a matured ovum. Now let's see the first phase, where the oogonia is becoming a primary oocyte. So I'll just take you to the picture here. We'll come to the the earliest slides a little later. Now if you look at the picture here, you can see that I'll just enlarge the slide. So you can see the oogonia in the picture there. The primordial germ cell is what we call as the oogonia. Now this oogonia is basically coming from the yolk sac of the embryo at about 6th week of pregnancy. Now this oogonia undergoes many mitotic divisions, and the number of oogonia becomes around 7 million. And now at birth, this primary mitosis stops, and there are around 7 million oocytes, or basically the oogonia. By the time the mitosis stops, we call it as the oocytes. Now at the time of birth, the baby girl has got around 7 million primary oocytes in her ovary. Now these oocytes need to undergo 2 meiotic divisions. It doesn't happen, please make it clear that these 2 meiotic divisions with which this primary oocyte needs to undergo is not a continuous process. Now the oocyte, in the beginning stages of development, we call it as a primary oocyte. Now the first meiotic division starts in the primary oocyte during fetal life itself. It occurs at around 8th week of pregnancy, and this first meiotic division is arrested in the phase called as prophase. You need to keep this in mind. So the first meiotic division, which is happening to the primary oocyte at 8th week of pregnancy, is stopped or arrested at prophase. Now what happens to the oocyte? The first meiotic division is stopped at prophase, but the oocyte continues to grow in size. Now the first meiotic division is never completed in the fetal life, not even till puberty. So what happens is, this first meiotic division, which is arrested at prophase, will be completed only just before ovulation. Therefore, what you need to understand is the lifespan of a primary oocyte can be up to 50 years, because ovulation continues up to this age or till menopause. Now, you all know that first meiotic division is getting arrested at prophase. And how does that happen? So basically, that arresting of the first meiotic division at prophase, and later on it continues, the process continues and it's completed just before ovulation, this whole magic is happening because of, the beautiful internal hormonal environment which is provided by the supporting cells which surrounds this primary oocyte. Now there's something called as the oocyte degeneration which is happening. Now this oocyte degeneration, it actually starts from the intrauterine life, because at the time of birth there are only about 7 million primary oocytes which will be remaining. I had made a reference earlier that the after the first mitotic division which is happening in the intrauterine life, the number of oocytes were 7 million, and the 7 million oocytes, because of this process of oocyte degeneration is happening, at the time of birth a female child has got only 7 million primary oocytes in the ovary, and by the time the child attains puberty, the number has drastically come down to 200,000, and by the age of 30 years the child has got just 26,000. You cannot call a child then, the lady has got around 26,000 oocytes remaining in the ovary. Now at the time of menopause, the oocytes number would have come down to a 2 or a 3 digit number. So a major difference in the male and the female gametogenesis is that the process of spermatogenesis is a continuous phenomenon, and there is no control on the production of sperm, or it's basically an unlimited supply of sperm, whereas the primary oocytes degenerate with age. The number of primary oocytes from 7 million during intrauterine life at birth becomes 1 million. By the time the lady is going to attain menopause, it would have come to a number of 250 or 300. And the oocytes at the time of menopause, you can see that there are absolutely no oocytes present in the female system. So now, where we have reached now is the process of mitosis is completed, and this primary oocyte now in the next step needs to be converted to the secondary oocyte. You can see it in the picture there, the transition from the green phase to the blue phase on this graphical picture. Now in the fetus, we had begun with an oogonia which is developed into a primary oocyte which undergoes the first meiotic division. The first meiotic division, I have already mentioned that it gets arrested in the prophase. So whatever this primary oocytes which are present at birth are all primary oocytes whose meiotic division is arrested at prophase, and it contains 46 chromosomes. And this situation will continue until puberty. Now the primary oocyte which gets selected or which is destined for ovulation during that particular menstrual cycle would complete its first meiotic division, which was arrested at prophase, and the ovum would be released just prior to ovulation. Now this division, when this happens, it results in the production of two structures. One you call as a daughter cell, which is called a secondary oocyte, which contains 23 chromosomes, and the other component is the first polar body. Now the cytoplasmic division which is happening here is quite unequal. So the secondary oocyte, it retains almost all of the cytoplasm, with polar body containing very little amount of the cytoplasm remaining. So this second component, the polar body, which is found, actually is kind of unfunctional, or better word used would be non-functional, when you talk about the oogenesis. Now when you go to the third stage, the secondary oocyte which forms the ovum, the second meiotic division, there are two meiotic divisions to occur. Now the second meiotic division which is occurring in the secondary oocyte, which is formed after ovulation, but it will be arrested in metaphase. The second meiotic division is completed when the egg is penetrated by the sperm. That's a very important point to be remembered there. The second meiotic division is also getting arrested at metaphase. The first meiotic division was getting arrested at prophase, and it will continue and release the ovum just prior to ovulation. But when does the second meiotic division start? It occurs in the secondary oocyte after ovulation, and it gets arrested in the metaphase, and it will continue only once the egg is penetrated by the sperm. So basically the meiotic cycle will be completed only after fertilization. Now as a result, what is happening is, or as a result of meiotic division, the ovum, which contains 23 chromosomes, and what is the other part called? The second polar body is formed. So I've already mentioned that the major cytoplasmic content will be in this the ovum, which contains the 23 chromosomes, and the second polar body which is formed, hardly it is non-functional. So the polar body is extruded. So now in the process of oogenesis, each primary oocyte produces only one ovum. That's a point you need to keep in mind. So the whole process of oogenesis happening, and we started from a primary oocyte, the end result would be single one ovum.